Emily Carter sat in the cold courtroom with her hands folded tightly in her lap and her heart racing like a wild horse against her ribcage as she watched the judge shuffle through papers that held her entire future within their pages, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed with an almost mocking persistence, while her lawyer Margaret whispered something she could not hear over the roaring anxiety that filled her mind. And across the polished wooden table sat Daniel, her husband of 8 years, looking equally devastated, yet somehow distant, as if an invisible wall had grown between them over the months of separation and legal battles. The custody hearing for their 6-year-old daughter Sophia had been scheduled for weeks, but nothing could have prepared Emily for the suffocating tension that now pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight, and she glanced toward the back of the courtroom where her mother sat with tears already forming in her weathered eyes, offering silent support that felt both comforting and heartbreaking at once. Because this was never supposed to happen, and their family was never supposed to be torn apart like delicate paper in careless hands. Daniel's lawyer stood up with a confident stride that made Emily's stomach twist into knots, and he began painting a picture of her as an unstable mother who could not provide the proper environment for raising a child, and each word felt like a dagger cutting deeper into her already wounded heart, and she wanted to scream that none of it was true, but Margaret had warned her to stay calm and let the process unfold naturally, though every fiber of her being rebelled against the silence. The accusations continued like a relentless storm, and Emily felt her resolve beginning to crack under the pressure. Because how could anyone believe she was anything less than devoted to Sophia when every breath she took was for that precious little girl with curly brown hair and eyes that sparkled like morning dew on summer grass? And the thought of losing her, even partially, was more than Emily could bear, and she gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. Daniel avoided her gaze throughout the entire opening statement, and that hurt more than any legal argument could because once upon a time they had been inseparable and madly in love, building dreams together of a perfect family and a future filled with laughter and joy. But somewhere along the way, things had fallen apart in ways neither of them fully understood, and now they sat as adversaries rather than partners. Margaret finally stood to present Emily's side, and she spoke eloquently about maternal bonds and stability and the countless ways Emily had sacrificed for Sophia's well-being, but Emily barely heard the words because her mind was racing toward a secret she had kept buried deep within her heart for years, and she wondered if today might be the day when everything would finally come to light.
The judge called for a brief recess, and Emily felt her legs trembling as she stood from the hard wooden chair that had become her prison for the past 2 hours, and Margaret guided her into a small conference room down the hallway where the walls seemed to close in around them, and the air felt thick with unspoken words that desperately needed to be released into the world before it was too late. Margaret placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder and asked if she was holding up all right. But Emily could barely form words because the weight of what she knew was crushing her from the inside out, and she had promised herself years ago that she would never speak of it, that she would protect everyone involved, no matter the personal cost. But now, as she faced losing Sophia, the promise felt like chains binding her to a sinking ship. Daniel appeared in the doorway, looking haggard and worn, as if he had aged a decade in just a few months. And for a moment, their eyes met, and Emily saw something flicker there that reminded her of the man she had fallen in love with at 23 when the world seemed full of endless possibilities, and their love felt like it could conquer anything. But that man seemed like a ghost now, barely recognizable beneath layers of anger and hurt. He asked if they could speak privately, and Margaret hesitated before stepping out of the room, leaving them alone together for the first time in weeks. And the silence stretched between them like an ocean too vast to cross. And Emily wanted to reach out, to touch his face, to remind him of all the beautiful moments they had shared, but her hands remained frozen at her sides. Daniel spoke first, and his voice cracked with emotion as he told her that he never wanted things to get this bad and that he still cared about her despite everything that had happened between them. And Emily felt tears streaming down her face because she cared about him too, more than he could possibly understand. But caring was not enough to fix what had been broken, and sometimes love was not enough to overcome the obstacles that life placed in your path. She took a deep breath and told him there was something he needed to know, something that would change everything about this custody battle and about their entire marriage. And Daniel looked confused and slightly afraid, as if sensing that whatever she was about to say would shatter the fragile reality he had constructed around himself. Emily revealed that Sophia was not biologically his daughter, and the words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, and Daniel stumbled backward as if physically struck, and his face went through 1,000 emotions at once, from shock to betrayal to devastation, and he demanded to know how this could be true when he had raised Sophia as his own for 6 years. Through her tears, Emily explained that she had discovered her pregnancy just days after a terrible mistake she had made during a rough patch in their marriage when Daniel had been traveling constantly for work and she had felt abandoned and lonely, and a colleague named Jason offered comfort that turned into something more, and she had been horrified by her actions and had chosen to never speak of it again, believing that Daniel was Sophia's father until a DNA test years later proved otherwise.
Daniel collapsed into a chair and buried his face in his hands, and his entire body shook with the magnitude of what Emily had just revealed. And she wanted to comfort him, but knew she had no right to after keeping such a devastating secret for so long. And the silence between them now was deafening, filled with years of lies and hidden truths that had finally been dragged into the merciless light. He looked up at her with eyes red from unshed tears and asked why she had never told him and whether their entire marriage had been built on deception. And Emily shook her head, desperately trying to make him understand that she had loved him with every fiber of her being and that keeping the secret had been an act of protection, not betrayal, because she knew the truth would destroy him and destroy their family. But Daniel was not listening anymore, and he stood abruptly and told her that he needed to think, and that he did not know if he could even look at her right now, much less continue with his custody battle, and Emily felt panic rising in her chest because she had not revealed this secret to hurt him, but rather to show him that biology did not define parenthood, and that he was Sophia's real father in every way that mattered. She grabbed his arm before he could leave and begged him to understand that Sophia needed him, and that she needed both of them to put aside their pain and work together for their daughter's sake, and that revealing this secret was the hardest thing she had ever done. But it was necessary because the court needed to know the full truth, and because she could not let him fight for custody under false pretenses. Daniel pulled away and walked out of the room, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts and her guilt, and she sank to the floor with her back against the wall, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, or if honesty, no matter how painful, was always the right choice. And Margaret returned moments later and found her there and helped her to her feet with a look of concern that spoke volumes. They returned to the courtroom, and Emily noticed that Daniel was already seated, but he would not meet her eyes. And the judge entered and called the hearing back to order, and Margaret whispered that Emily needed to be strong for what came next because the hardest part was still ahead. Emily stood when the judge asked if she had anything to add to her testimony, and her voice shook as she requested permission to make a statement that would be difficult, but necessary for the court to hear. And the judge granted permission with a curious expression, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Emily began to speak. She told the court the secret she had kept for years, and about how Daniel had been Sophia's father in every meaningful way, despite not being her biological parent, and how he had changed diapers and attended school plays and kissed scraped knees and read bedtime stories with a devotion that transcended genetics, and the courtroom erupted in whispers and shocked gasps. Daniel's lawyer jumped to his feet and demanded to know if this was some kind of manipulation tactic, and the judge banged the gavel calling for order, while Emily continued speaking with tears streaming down her face, explaining that she was revealing this truth because she wanted the court to understand that custody should be about love and commitment, not blood, and that both she and Daniel deserved to remain in Sophia's life. The judge looked stunned and asked Daniel if he had known about this, and Daniel slowly shook his head and admitted that he had just learned the truth minutes ago, and his voice was hollow and distant, as if he were speaking from somewhere far away. And Emily could see the devastation written across his face.
The courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence as everyone processed the bombshell that Emily had just dropped, and the judge leaned back in her chair, studying both Emily and Daniel with an expression that was equal parts compassion and concern. And she asked for a moment to review the case files while the lawyers whispered frantically among themselves, trying to understand how this revelation would impact their strategies. Emily remained standing,
with her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. And she glanced at Daniel, who sat motionless, staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. And she wanted to run to him, to tell him that she was sorry for everything. But her feet felt rooted to the floor, and all she could do was watch as the man she loved crumbled before her eyes. The judge finally spoke, and her voice was measured but firm, as she addressed both parties, and explained that this revelation complicated matters significantly, but did not necessarily change the fundamental question of what was best for Sophia. And she asked Daniel directly if he still wished to pursue custody, given what he had just learned. Daniel stood slowly, and Emily held her breath, waiting for him to walk away to abandon them both and declare that he wanted nothing to do with a child who was not his blood. But instead, he did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom, including Emily herself. And he spoke in a voice thick with emotion about how biology meant nothing compared to the 6 years he had spent loving and raising Sophia. He told the court that he had been the one to hold Sophia when she had nightmares and teach her to ride a bike without training wheels and nurse her through countless colds and fevers and celebrate every milestone no matter how small. And those moments were not erased by a DNA test, and his love for his daughter was not diminished by learning she did not share his genes. Emily felt fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but these were different from before, because they contained a glimmer of hope mixed with the pain, and she watched as Daniel turned to look at her for the first time since her revelation, and in his eyes she saw not just hurt, but also something else, something that looked almost like understanding. The judge seemed moved by Daniel's words, and she acknowledged that his commitment to Sophia was evident and admirable. But she also needed to address the matter of Emily's deception and the impact it might have on the court's decision regarding custody arrangements. And Emily's lawyer, Margaret, stood to defend her client's actions, explaining that Emily had kept the secret out of love, not malice. Margaret argued that Emily had been protecting her family from unnecessary pain, and that her decision to reveal the truth now, in open court, demonstrated her commitment to honesty and transparency, even when it cost her everything. And she emphasized that Emily had been a devoted mother who had never wavered in her care for Sophia and who deserved to maintain her relationship with her daughter. Daniel's lawyer countered that the deception, regardless of motivation, showed a pattern of dishonesty that could not be ignored, and that the court needed to consider whether Emily could be trusted to act in Sophia's best interests moving forward. And the arguments went back and forth like a violent storm, with Emily caught in the middle, wondering if her attempt at honesty had ultimately sealed her fate. Then Daniel did something unexpected, and he stood again, without prompting from his lawyer, and asked permission to speak directly. And the judge granted his request, looking curious about what he might say, and the entire courtroom leaned forward in anticipation as Daniel walked toward Emily, stopping just a few feet from where she stood. He looked into her eyes and spoke words that cut through all the legal arguments and courtroom formality. And he told her that what she had done was wrong, and that the betrayal hurt more than anything he had ever experienced. But he also acknowledged that he had not been present enough during their marriage, and that he had taken her for granted and pushed her away when she needed him most.
Emily could barely breathe as Daniel continued speaking, and his voice grew stronger with each word, as he told the court that their marriage had been broken long before this custody battle began, and that they had both made mistakes and failed each other in countless ways, but none of that changed the fact that Sophia deserved to have both of her parents in her life, actively and equally. He proposed that instead of fighting each other, they should fight for a solution that kept their daughter's well-being at the center of every decision. And he looked at Emily with an expression that was raw and vulnerable, and asked if she would be willing to work with him to create a co-parenting arrangement that honored their shared love for Sophia, even if their romantic relationship could not be salvaged. Emily nodded through her tears and found her voice finally, and she told Daniel that she had never stopped loving him, and that revealing the secret had been her desperate attempt to show him that their bond with Sophia transcended biology, and that she wanted nothing more than to rebuild the trust she had shattered, even if it took years to accomplish. The judge watched this exchange with what appeared to be genuine emotion, softening her professional demeanor, and she called for another brief recess to consider everything she had heard, and Emily and Daniel were left standing face to face in the courtroom as people filed out around them, and for the first time in months, they truly saw each other, without the walls of anger and resentment blocking their view. Daniel reached out tentatively and touched Emily's hand, and the simple contact sent electricity through her entire body, reminding her of all the passion they had once shared, and all the moments of intimacy and connection that had defined their early years together. And she realized that despite everything, some part of that fire still burned between them, waiting to be rekindled. They moved to a quiet corner of the hallway and sat together on a wooden bench, and Daniel asked about Jason, the biological father, and Emily explained that he had moved away years ago and had never known about Sophia and had no interest in being part of their lives, and Daniel absorbed this information with a thoughtful expression. He admitted that learning the truth had felt like dying, but that hearing Emily speak in court about his role as Sophia's father had also reminded him of why he had fallen in love with her in the first place, because she was brave and fierce and willing to sacrifice everything for the people she loved, even when it meant exposing her own vulnerabilities and mistakes. Emily took his hand in both of hers and told him that she understood if he could never forgive her, but that she hoped they could find a way forward for Sophia's sake. And Daniel surprised her by saying that forgiveness was not something that happened in an instant, but rather a choice that had to be made every day, and that he was willing to try if she was. When they returned to the courtroom, the judge announced her decision, and she granted joint custody with equal parenting time, emphasizing that both Emily and Daniel had demonstrated their commitment to Sophia despite the difficult circumstances. And she encouraged them to seek family counseling to address the underlying issues in their relationship and to learn how to co-parent effectively. The relief that washed over Emily was overwhelming, and she felt her knees buckle slightly, but Daniel steadied her with a hand on her elbow, and they exchanged a look that contained multitudes of unspoken words and complicated emotions. And as they left the courthouse together, they knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long time, they felt like they were on the same team. Over the following weeks, Emily and Daniel attended counseling sessions where they unpacked years of hurt and miscommunication and slowly began to rebuild a foundation of trust. And they started having family dinners with Sophia, where laughter gradually replaced tension, and their daughter's bright smile reminded them of what they were fighting for. One evening, after Sophia had gone to bed, Daniel and Emily sat on the porch of what had been their shared home, and they talked honestly about whether their romantic relationship could be salvaged. And Daniel admitted that part of him still loved her deeply and wanted to try again, but needed time to fully process everything. Emily told him she would wait as long as it took, and that she was committed to proving herself worthy of his trust again. And Daniel leaned over and kissed her forehead gently, and in that simple gesture, Emily felt the first real spark of hope that they might emerge from this darkness stronger and more passionate than before, because sometimes love required being broken completely before it could be rebuilt into something more resilient and true and beautiful.